that particular hymn, Jerusalem. It's got both verses, and I want you to pay attention, and the lyrics will be on the screen. I want you to kind of pay attention to the lyrics, and then we'll talk about that. Get started there. Okay, so first verse of the song. Anybody remember what some of the words were in the first verse there? Okay. Was the Holy Lamb of God seen in England's pleasant pastures, whatever? Did those feet walk upon this land and that sort of thing? What do you suppose that is based on? What is the basis of that wording? What is it getting at? Well, yeah, as simple as that, Harold. They're just saying, is it true that Jesus lived and walked right here in this land? Where would the idea of that even originate? William Blake wrote the words to that as a poem in 1804. He was born in 1757, but he wrote that poem in 1804. So what do you think? Where do you think the ideas of that came from? Okay, there's truth to that. But there were numerous records and traditions all around Cornwall and parts of England about Jesus' time there, especially his time with Joseph, his uncle. And other family members as well. There is a vast number of ancient traditions and artifacts and everything else related to Jesus spending a lot of time there. And obviously, as you've seen before, his uncle Joseph, the Tin Man, was there off and on all the time, and he ended up dying there. He went back and lived there and did his greatest missionary and teaching work there. He started the seminary, if you want to call it that, a school of missions there, and a big library, all of that. That was intact until 1184 or something like that, when it was destroyed by fire by the Romans. But the evidence and the historical records of family members of Jesus and Jesus himself actually having been there in that land is abundant. There's a ton of materials. I want to get into a couple of the other things that were mentioned in the song there. It mentions the people coming to faith from the presence of the Messiah there and that sort of thing. And it almost seemed to say in spite of or from those dark satanic mills. Okay? What do you suppose that's a reference to? Well, it mentions mills, dark satanic mills. Okay, you're thinking it had something to do with the metal production or whatever, because they did have all the tin and copper mines there. I mean, that was historically renowned as the source for tin, which was used all throughout the Roman Empire and other parts of the world during that time for not only tin production and copper as well, but for use in creating different alloys that were starting to be produced then. So you're saying maybe the dark satanic mills had something to do with the smelting and production on that. Okay, valid. That was one of my first thoughts on it too.
Were they making clothing outside of people's homes?
Well, it's possible. One of the things, and I don't know the exact answer on this, although I got one that might be more solid than some of the others. This is 1804, and some of the interpretations of that, it said he was referring to the Industrial Revolution and the impact it was having in England. But tell me something. What level of impact would you say Industrial Revolution was having when William Blake wrote this in 1804? I mean, where are we in the Industrial Revolution at that point? Pretty early. I don't think there were any big production facilities going on that you would call like mills like that or anything. And Another line of thought on it was this. I got this from a couple of sources who said, well, William Blake was considered a pretty radical Christian in his days, and that was one of the terms that he used to refer to the institutional churches of the time. How about that, huh? Okay, so another question. Verse 1 and verse 2 both talk about Jerusalem being built in this land. Okay, where is Jerusalem? Geographically speaking, the actual city of Jerusalem is in the country of Israel. We know where that is. So obviously there's some kind of a metaphor being used here with this. Could you glean anything from the lyrics there as to what William Blake could have meant by talking about Jerusalem being built here?
The Jewish community.
Okay, potential for that. And let's follow that along a little bit, though, because there had been an extensive Jewish community all throughout the British Isles at this point for well, in the 1800s there, since back, I'm going to say since about 600 BC. Another thing that's interesting I learned in a little bit of research just recently was the Jewish miners and smelters who were all throughout the British Isles, but especially in the area of Cornwall where there was the most tin mines and everything, seemed to be exempt from all the laws except for a particular set of laws that were specific to the mining community. Isn't that a little odd? But there was quite a relationship in history there with the Hebrew people. So even given that there had been a Hebrew population there for quite some time, and again, William Blake was a Christian, not Jewish. He was a Gentile Christian, but he could have meant that. What are some of your other thoughts? Why would he keep going back to this whole idea of Jerusalem being built here? And obviously he was referring to Britain at the time. And I've got no right or wrong answer on this, by the way. I'm just curious to see what, as you delve into this, what ideas do you come up with? So a lot of the thinkers on this believe that he was referring to the economy, an economic sort of utopia where they didn't have really poor people and people whose needs weren't met, and that Christianity would bring about the Jerusalem, and Jerusalem being kind of a euphemism or metaphor for like a heaven on earth, a utopia, so to speak. Think he meant something like that? Maybe, not sure. But that song has been sung in Britain ever since it was written then in 1804, and you still hear it quite a bit. Most people don't pay any attention at all to the lyrics. But did you catch that verse 1 that was direct reference? The entire verse 1 was a direct reference to Jesus in Britain. Did y'all follow that? Okay. Now I want to bring up again the other song that I played for you a few weeks back, a modern rendering of an ancient poem, Joseph Was a Tin Man. What do you make of that? It was pretty specific in the lyrics, wasn't it? And even that Joseph had said that he was going to eventually come back and live permanently there in Britain, which he did. Very interesting. Okay, so I want to get into tonight's little handout. And most of this I've taken from the writings of a historian named Arnold Kennedy. And I think, just a second, I need to check my dates on Arnold Kennedy, but I'm pretty sure we're looking at late 1800s. 1 second. I had it right here in front of me, but I lost that page. Let's see, he was writing these. No, they've all been republished. I believe that's about the time that he was writing. It was late 1800s with this. And some of his language is a little odd for our understanding. I just wanted you to know that. Where Mary Lou questioned it, I went ahead and updated it with a little bit more modern English. But this first couple of paragraphs I want to just go through real quick. There's some reasoning going on here, and so tonight we're getting into scriptures just a little bit, but think about some of this from a perspective you haven't thought about it in the past, is what I'm asking you to do. So, starting off with his quote, "It was not at the time of Jesus at all uncommon for people from the Middle East to visit Britain. They had been doing it by the thousands for hundreds of years before the Virgin Mary was born." What do you think of that statement? I have been harping on this all along, but it's not just me. Other people know this too. I will say, however, that kind of travel was not happening among the peasants unless they would get on board a ship as a ship's hand or something like that. It was the wealthy. It was the elite, the top of society, who did that kind of travel. Debbie?
When they were sailing, did they go through that little bitty body of water or part of the ocean that goes right under Spain? Is that how they went?
I don't know their exact sea routes, but we can learn a few things about some of the places that Joseph had been trading. And it wasn't just them traveling, it was many others from the Middle East who would have been of any kind of wealth or royal status, and they seem to be very well traveled. And a trip to Europe and Western Europe from the Middle East didn't seem like that big a deal to them back then. It happened all the time. Interesting, huh? But just for a couple of examples, one of the routes for the tin and copper from England getting up into Italy and Rome and Rome in Italy and other parts of northern Italy was overland from the port in southern France. And they had carts. The ships would bring it that far, and then they would take it by cart on up to other locations. So all the trading didn't just take place by sea, but I'm just saying, if he was sailing from the British Isles back into the Mediterranean and then going across the coast there, he was catching the southern coast of Gaul at the time, which we now call France. Interestingly enough, the time he was exiled from Israel, along with several others, that's where he ended up, and that wasn't by accident. It was a place he knew very well. And of course had others arranged to meet him there at that time. Isn't that amazing? Think about this in Joseph of Arimathea's life. Born into a wealthy family, he gets into the trading business at a very young age and takes over a lot of that and expands it, and has got ships going and picking up these ores and buying them there in Britain, to the point where he was there a lot. And meanwhile, he also had a residence in North Africa at Marmor. Did any of you do what I asked or suggested you could do? Do whatever search engine you use, whether you use Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever your favorite search engine is. Do a search, Joseph of Marmor, and see what comes up, just sometime just for grins. Marmore. You'll be surprised at the results you get. But he had a residence established there at that port town in what would have been the western side of Egypt, on the northern coast up against the Mediterranean there. Okay, so he was well known in North Africa. He was well known in many European countries, and stories are his ships traveled down around the coast of India and even some in South America trading. And there are some indications of Hebrew culture and civilizations in ancient South America as well. Pretty interesting stuff. And so when I'm watching one of these TV documentaries or something, and they say, well, these people from the Middle East knew nothing of the Americas or anything until after the time of Columbus or whatever, all this stuff. I'm just thinking, they knew a whole lot more than you guys think they knew, obviously. So Joseph had developed all of this and was named the Nobilis Decurium in Rome, and that literally is the management level of the mining districts of the Roman Empire. They said that it was, in Pompeii, they said it was easier to become a Roman senator than a decurium, which is what the title of Joseph was in Rome. He was, again, he had clout and status there. He also had clout and status among the Jews in Jerusalem. And of all things, when, after Pontius Pilate is removed and the persecution increases, and he and 11 or 12 others are put on this boat and put out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and they did this with a lot of other people too. Some of them died. Many were rescued as well, or found shore and survived. But his little group made landfall somewhere in North Africa, and got passage from there to one of his favorite places there in Gaul, South France. And Philip the Evangelist meets them there, and a contingent from Britain meets them there as well. And he ends up traveling then to Britain and makes his home there for the rest of his life, and lived to a ripe old age for that matter, and was probably one of the most influential Christian missionaries of all history, if you can kind of get your head around that. But what I'm kind of getting to this evening is I'm not going to go with hard facts on everything. I just want to ask some questions and get your wheels spinning in a direction they probably haven't turned a whole lot. Okay, and here's the premise of a whole lot of what I'm covering this evening, and it's simply this. In the Bible, in other historical documents around Israel, you don't see anything about Jesus except for the brief bit about his birth and the flight to Egypt and back. And then you've got the one little event when he's 12 at the Passover, okay? And then nothing else, no mention, no nothing until he's right about 30 years old. Okay, he doesn't have friends in town. He doesn't have people that have been his acquaintances throughout his life or anything like that. That's pretty obvious. And yet, somehow, I grew up and went through 3 degrees in ministry and practically a 4th degree in ministry with the understanding that Jesus grew up right there in the Galilee region of Israel, and trained as a carpenter with his dad in his carpenter shop. And you know what I've discovered now? I can't find any evidence that any of that happened. I see a lot of evidence that it probably didn't happen. Nobody knew him there. He shows up, and who's this guy? Oh yeah, isn't he? See what I mean? Where was he? For that matter, where was Mary? And my contention on this is that I would maintain Jesus did an awful lot of traveling. He did an awful lot of studying. He was well traveled, very well studied when he was 30 years old and began his ministry there in Israel and Jerusalem. But let's go on with this. First of all, start off about the travel. Romans sent children to Britain to be educated. It is history's warped view of the isolation of the British Isles at that time that makes the divine visit to Britain seem so incredible to us. Now, the wording on that's a little convoluted for our thinking today, but it's simply this. It was not uncommon at all for the Romans to send their children the wealthy who could do this to send their children to the schools and universities in Britain for their education. It was the Druids who had started forming the universities there in Britain that were world renowned for their very high level, precise education in languages, in rhetoric, mathematics, everything imaginable. The Druids, by the way, came from a Hebrew background originally. Did you know this? And many of the Druidic rituals have their roots in the ancient Hebrew rituals and came from that. And so the beginning of this vast number of universities in the British Isles started with that, and it, of course, had grown and expanded by the time the first century came along. But pretty much all of the wealthy and royal of Rome and all the other areas, if they wanted higher education and quality education and could afford it, Britain was the place to go, the British Isles. Okay, so for us, again, it's history's warped view that British Isles were so isolated at the time that makes this divine visit to Britain seem so incredible to us. Now, obviously, Arnold Kennedy is the underlying assumption when he says it makes the divine visit to Britain seem so incredible to us. What is his underlying assumption here? That there was a divine visit to Britain, right? And what does that mean? When you say divine, who are we referring to? Jesus. See what his underlying assumption is what? Okay. Is it hard to say that? Mary Lou.
But he's also assuming that everybody knows what that happened.
Right. He's not, yeah, he's assuming that it's common knowledge at the time. Okay, thank you. Okay, next sentence. In fact, the traffic was not all one way. Tradition has it that Anna, Mary's mother, wife of whom would this be? Heli, wife of Heli, came from Cornwall and had undertaken this journey in the opposite direction. You guys want to throw some comments at this for a minute? How is it that the wealthiest guy in the world who happens to be over here not far from Jerusalem ends up married to a Brit? You don't think with his son Joseph having traveled all over the world that Heli just sat around the home place his entire life and wasn't a world traveler either as well, right? Yes, sir.
Just to kind of throw another wrinkle in this. I've been wondering about, like, with Elizabeth and Zacharias, the parents of John the Baptist, how do they fit in? I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of you here or something.
Well, we can get, I've got a little information on that we might get to, but remember now, Elizabeth and Mary are cousins.
Yeah, that's good.
And so John the Baptist and Jesus, therefore, were cousins and may have been double cousins. Yeah, so I'll try to get back to that. I'll try not to get too off on that right now, but we'll hopefully save some space for it. Is it so far-fetched that Anna, the wife of Heli, came from Britain and that Heli was a world traveler himself? It's not far-fetched at all once you start understanding these people. Now, the reason I grabbed the writings of this guy Kennedy here is he's saying a lot of what I've been saying, he's just saying it differently, and so he agrees with me, so he must be right, okay? I mean, we all think that way, right? He agrees with me, he's smart, he's right, you know. The ones who don't, man, they just need enlightenment, and we could teach them a thing or two, you know. The confirmation bias we all carry along. No, seriously, I try to guard against that. But I do like it when I find an ancient or earlier source that is saying in different words just exactly the same thing that I've picked up. That's kind of cool when you find that. So, yeah, I'm a little bit enamored with Arnold Kennedy at the moment, I'll say that, okay? Get this. The main stumbling block is that most people do not think of Bible people, Mary, Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, Pilate, Herod, and the disciples, and Paul as world travelers. Maybe Paul only on his missionary journeys, right? Mentally, they think of people of Bible times as being chained to their main moment in history. And I picture it as a two-dimensional flannel board. He stuck him on there, and that picture of them is where they're trapped. You know, example, he says this, thus, we're inclined not to think of Pilate in any other context than standing on the balcony on that fateful day washing his hands. I can see it right on the flannel board right now. And that's where we've got him. And yet, he had quite a bit of life other than that. And he had quite a few other geographic locations other than that. He had family relations, he had conflicts, and this is just one random character. But we tend to think of all the people of the Bible in very two-dimensional terms and as forever locked into the event that we find mentioned in the Bible or whatever. Oh yeah, he's the guy who did this. And we seldom learn much more than that about them, right? Pilate and all the Bible people are to most people disembodied concepts, and we see them confined within their historic moment or moments. So true. To begin thinking of these people differently is quite a mental exercise, but it provides an awful lot of freedom. And something I'm learning more and more about, and here I am in my 60s just starting to learn this. People generally don't gravitate toward freedom very readily, whether it's freedom of thought or freedom of behavior, especially if you've been in a situation or circumstances that is not conducive to that or that doesn't encourage it. I want to just give you an example of something I just saw today, okay? A lot of the churches leaving the United Methodist denomination are going to the Global Methodist Church, okay? Which is basically set up a whole structure and hierarchy pretty much identical to the United Methodist, except that they don't have a trust clause and they say they're not ever going to do gay weddings. Other than that, everything is identical to the United Methodist system, okay? So I'm trying to follow and keep my kind of thumb on the pulse of what's happening among all these people doing this. So I'm in a few social media groups where they make posts and ask questions and proclaim things or whatever. And today I saw a post that I've probably seen at least 50 different people say, and it was this: what is the official Bible version of the Global Methodist Church? In other words, what Bible can we use? What Bible do they want us to use? You see what I'm saying? Or is the Global Methodist Church going to institute weekly communion? I sure hope they do. You see what's happening here? People are wanting an institution to tell them what to do and when to do it. Why? Because that's what they're familiar with. It's their comfort zone, and they're hoping their comfort zone doesn't leave them. I want an institution that tells me what to do. Otherwise, I've got no anchor, and it's kind of scary. I'm afraid of freedom. Likewise, now carry that over for just about everyone. We tend to keep our thinking within the confines, the boundaries or parameters of what's acceptable thought. Let's just say, here's the boundaries. Within these two is acceptable thought. Now, I'm going to move over here and think over here a little bit. That's not okay. That can't be true because it's outside the boundaries of acceptable thought, isn't it? You going with me on this? Therefore, to be talking about Jesus and his family or any of these historical biblical characters in the way that we are right now, we find ourselves outside the boundaries of normally acceptable thought, and therefore, I jokingly call it Advanced Heresy 502. Why? Because to anybody who is not studying this, we are, all of us in this room, outside the boundaries of acceptable thinking. We are outside the lines, and you just don't go there. You're not free to go there. You starting to get this? I guarantee you, I could start talking about this among a group of pastoral colleagues, and the majority of them would leave that conversation or announce to the others that I was nuts. And all it is something I've actually studied rather than just accept what I've assumed and learned. You know, Jesus the boy down in Nazareth working in a woodworking carpenter shop with his dad as an apprentice or whatever. I'm going to just throw that and say, didn't happen. We've got tons of evidence there was no way that could have happened, and yet, how many sermons and Bible lessons have I heard based on something like that? Knowing your Bible can ruin a lot of good preaching, my friends. Just saying to you. Okay, so we just finished this, and as Pilate and all the Bible people are to most people disembodied concepts, and we see them confined within their historic moment or moments. Continuing, if there is one thing that organized religion or most brand names has succeeded in doing, it is to make the very real people we read of in the New Testament into almost mythological figures as cardboard, cut out as those brightly colored sheets of nativity figures they used to give us in Sunday school. You following this? Because once you start to get your head around some of this, you're going to find some freedom of thought and expand your awareness and your quest for knowledge beyond all the walls and boundaries that have confined you your entire life. That's what we're getting to here. I hope you're grasping this. Yes, sir.
In that vein of thought, I've not noticed anything that you said, anything that departs from my understanding of the basic teachings of Scripture, the gospel.
Well, right. This all supports a solid Christian theology and the basics of the gospel more so than the traditional narrative does.
Yeah, I mean, and even to narrow it down more, you put it in terms of Wesleyan thought.
Oh, absolutely.
To me, it seems like it. I don't know, is there any point that you see where it would?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's just that if we stick to many of the traditional narratives about Jesus, his family, and so forth, we've almost got to do historical contortions to maintain those stories. And we've got to just put on our blinders to anything we read historically that counters that.
But I mean, as I understand it, Jesus being in the British Isles in England, really, there's nothing in Orthodox Christian teachings that would.
Correct. Correct. There's nothing in the actual doctrine and teachings. It's just those underlying stories and narratives that everybody just assumes to be so. And once we start reading and making discoveries, we find out there's no substance to those stories at all.
And you still see Jesus saved.
Well, yeah, and you even see more directly how that impacts the whole world when you can put the fairy tales aside and read the real history, is what I'm thinking. But let's go on with this. Okay, we just finished the brightly colored nativity figures like we see at Christmas or get in Sunday school, and we've reduced everybody down to that pretty much. And yet secular history is not at all silent about them. Legend is fertile with accounts of their exploits, travels, and their relationships, and history tells us a lot about how those people lived and how they traveled. This is good stuff because he's right on with this. I found out that if you get a 1943 set of Encyclopedia Britannica, everything that I have done in this whole series is found right there. And even probably some later versions before they started washing all the history out of the encyclopedias and stuff. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned at the very beginning that there was a change in the keeping of the historical records. And what was that?
Well, there's been a couple of times, and that is, so there's two different things that fit the description of what you're talking about. The second one is that I'll bring here is the one that I've mentioned more. At the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, many of their historical records got destroyed. and if you recall, is the Benjamites who were entrusted with keeping the genealogical records to know everyone who was descendants of King David and who was in line for the throne of Israel and all this sort of thing, even though they weren't really honoring so far as who was on the throne in Israel at the time. And after AD 70 and the Jews were dispersed and everything, they all became more diligent about keeping their own family and historical records. And so that shifted then, and they lost a lot of history. But what I was referring to was in the late 4th, early 5th century, when the Roman Church, it made a big change after 313 AD when Constantine became the emperor and decided everybody's going to be Christians, but not the kind of Christians you think. Then that's when the government of Rome and the leadership of the church became indistinguishable from one another. And it was about 150 or so years later when they first started to introduce the teaching of, well, two things. One was the perpetual virginity of Mary. In other words, she stayed a virgin the rest of her life, never gave birth to any other kids, never had sex with her husband, any of that. Right, and then, so that's the one teaching. And so if you'll read in like some of the Catholic explanations of the scriptures that talk about Jesus' brothers and his sisters, they will say that one of two or three things. One of the explanations are they're really cousins. Another explanation is that Joseph, our Tecton, had a previous marriage before he was married to Mary, and these were children from that marriage. But there's two or three different explanations like that that are often given, rather than just saying, well, they're actually his half-brothers and sisters because they're Mary and Joseph's children, which is pretty clear. Okay, so that was kind of swept aside. But the other part that really made a shift and that frustrates me to no end is it was the teaching of the Immaculate Conception that caused them to shift some writings. And I won't say get rid of them, because I'm convinced that some of these documents that are missing today are hidden away in the Vatican somewhere. They hold on to that stuff, you know. I mean, they're...
Did you say that one of the popes took some of those writings away, or destroyed them or something?
Well, there's been, you know, there was a period of time,
Like Pope Pius.
I'm not sure on that.
Oh, okay.
But again, the teaching on the Immaculate Conception, until just a few years ago, I was of the opinion when they say Immaculate Conception, they mean Jesus was conceived without sin. And I was wrong. And again, it's not me saying this, just look it up. Catholic doctrine is very clear about when they say Immaculate Conception, it is the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that she was conceived in her mother's womb without sin. Okay, I mean, and again, they would, theologically apply divinity or deity even to Mary because of that, and say that she's begotten of God. And again, that's my words, not theirs. I'm using my words to say something they wouldn't say, but they would say it in other words. But again, that Mary was immaculately conceived. And the frustrating point on that to me is that Joseph, son of Heli, was brother to Mary, daughter of Heli. And today, you can hardly find any documentation to support that at all. It's very sparse. Again, they're saying Joseph was Mary's uncle and the brother of her dad, which again, the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence does tend to go the other way, that he was her brother, therefore the uncle of Jesus and not the great uncle of Jesus. And not that it matters a whole lot, but it does matter. Okay, so anyway, that was the shift in history. And there's been others, that have happened when the official church introduced a new teaching or whatever. The things that would tend to oppose that, they downplay those or give them a new interpretation. It's happened with other civilizations all throughout history to do that sort of thing. But, so anyway. All right, so I got through those paragraphs. I got a series of just questions here about this. Again, mostly designed to prompt our thinking in another direction, rather than designed just to set a plate of information in front of you to digest, okay? In other words, you see the difference? Some of these questions will prompt you to go in search of information. Other types of teaching sets the information in front of you like a buffet for you to eat it up as you choose, okay? This is the first of those, designed more to prompt your thinking outside the boundaries of acceptable thought and to find some freedom in taking yourself out there. Because it's a pretty rare thing to arrive there and to feel the freedom to stay there. Yes, sir.
All of this begs the question to me, what did Jesus do after the death of his Father? And the reason I'm saying this is because, did he continue work in the trade?
I don't think he ever did.
Because when he went back to Nazareth, people said, isn't this the son of the carpenter?
Right. Isn't he the son of that carpenter guy that used to be up here?
Yeah.
Right.
Where's he coming across with all of this stuff? Isn't he just the son of that carpenter?
Right, because he hadn't been around. And I'm going to say, I doubt that he ever was an apprentice carpenter. He may have been for a short time, but from everything I can see, from the time Jesus was 12 at the Passover event that we read about in the Gospels, that Joseph the Tecton probably didn't live more than about 2 years beyond that, and maybe less. I'm not sure how he died or anything. It's just that's where he kind of disappears. And
There's another story that
Yeah.
bothers me, is when the wedding at Cana, when Mary asked him to change the water into wine.
right,
he
right.
said, I'm not ready to do this yet.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. That's a really interesting story. He does it, and it was the first recorded miracle. But yeah, there's multiple sources. I was just reading a new source I got today. Let me see if I can find this to read real quick. Just to read you this statement, which I found really interesting. It was this document. I'll come back to that because I don't want to waste your time while I look through this. It was just a quote, but basically it was just a historical document saying that it was well known that when Joseph, the husband of Mary, died, that their family relative, it was mentioned in this source, it didn't state exactly, but the family relative from Mary's side, Joseph of Arimathea, took over the role as legal guardian or father in that family. And again, there's just source after source that gives us that, okay? Let me get back onto this. We're going to go through some of these little questions here that will address many of those things as well. But so far as what did Jesus do after Joseph the Tecton died, my personal belief is he was doing a lot of traveling with his uncle Joseph the Tin Man, and probably already had been before Joseph the Tecton died, and that at a couple, probably more than one time, he was in Britain for a prolonged period of time for educational purposes. Probably at least 2 different stays there that lasted more than a couple of years, and maybe even longer. And part of what Arnold Kennedy gets at in many of his writings and his rhetorical questions here about is he thinks that Mary did as well. So anyway, and by the way, she ended up dying in France. You knew that, right? Anyway, what's that? Yes. When they were on the boat and landed there in South France in Gaul, and Joseph of Arimathea and some of the others went on down to Britain, Mary, the mother of Jesus, stayed in France and did some ministry there and ultimately died there, interestingly enough. Okay, here's some of our rhetorical questions for us to play around with, all right? Is it reasonable to believe the entirety of the life of Jesus and Mary would have been completely ignored if they had been in Israel during this period? What I'm saying is, from the time of the Passover event when Jesus was 12, all the way up to the beginning of his ministry when he was 30, we've got nothing recorded in Israel, in that land at all, about Mary or about Jesus. And yet, there was plenty of evidence that there was the miraculous birth, there was the announcement of the Messiah, and there was the visit of the Magi, there was the proclamation of Simeon at the temple, and all of this. It was the biggest news around. And then suddenly, you've got a period of, 20 some odd years, and nothing said about him at all. What happened? And one day then Jesus shows up out here, and everybody's, who's that? Isn't wasn't he the son of that carpenter who used to live down there in Nazareth years ago? Whatever. You see what I'm getting at?
You're talking about in secular history as well as in biblical.
Yeah. Just a striking absence. But despite the gigantic news of his arrival and all the events surrounding that, then suddenly, like a wisp of smoke, gone.
Been told about some of the incidents that have occurred, and they address Jesus as a young child.
There are some, and obviously some of those have more historic credibility than others. You just have to go from one to the next to determine that, and see how it lines up with other. But let me, because I know our time's just about up, let me just hit a couple of these questions real quick, then I'm just going to leave it with you. I might squeeze these into the next week lesson for our last week. Hang on just a second, Harold. Let's hit this next question. Why was not the early life of the miraculous mother and child the inspiration for constant speculation and writing during the time? If they were there. Okay, next question. Why, apart from the Passover incident when Jesus was 12, is there no record in the Bible of anything he said or did in the Holy Land until he returned? For that matter, anywhere else either, right? Why do we read nothing in the Bible about Jesus apart from this Passover event until he was 30 years old? Why do we read nothing again in the Bible about Mary till Jesus was 30 years old? Why would Jesus be asked to pay the visiting strangers tax if he had been living in Judea all this time? You got this? Okay. Early in his ministry, right? You remember that? Had to go get a coin out of a fish. Why did local historians not mention Jesus as being present during this period? He was the biggest thing that ever happened in Israel. Why are there records in Britain for this period of time when he was missing from the Holy Land if he had not been in Britain? Did not the Star of Bethlehem, the wise men, the herald angels proclaim him to be the Savior at his birth? Didn't Mary herself make that very proclamation in the Magnificat? In other words, it wasn't a mystery. It was proclaimed everywhere at the time of his birth. Didn't Simon or Simeon declare that Jesus was the Messiah there at the temple in the beautiful song of Simeon in Luke chapter 2? Even Herod gave testimony to that in the slaughter of the innocents, where he set about to kill all of the newborn boys up to 2 years old. Why? The king had been born, that's why. He was convinced. Anyway, just a few rhetorical questions there to say, Jesus had to be somewhere, and the traditional story of him working in a carpenter shop with his dad Joseph during that time doesn't seem to suffice or to give us an answer on that at all. Now, there was that one mention, wait a minute, who is this? Wasn't he the son of that carpenter guy? Who had been gone for quite a while at that time himself. But that was the only thing they connected him to. Here's an example. I moved away from where I grew up in Dallas, so I went in the military, went all over the world for like 6 years, then I went somewhere else to college, then I went to Africa and did mission work there for a while. And so I never really went back to live there in Dallas after that. I'd go to visit my parents, time or two a year, or as I could. When social media came about, and I was a few years late getting into Facebook and stuff, but when I did, I started having people from back when I was in high school there in Dallas connect with me, okay? And one guy contacted me. He said, I remember you. Aren't you the guy who parted his hair in the middle one day in the 4th grade? One day in the 4th grade. Okay, and it's been years and years, and seen or heard anything. Yeah, isn't that the guy who? And the one little thing, I was like, maybe I did. It seems like something I'd probably do, and that's what they identified me with. Take any small town, somebody's gone for a while, and they come back later on, and everybody will think of them as a 16-year-old or whatever it was they did their junior year in high school or something like that. Oh yeah, you dropped the ball and didn't make that touchdown that could have won the district championship. I remember you, right? And it's like, yeah, well, I've kind of lived and done a few things since then, But the small town, that's what they know, right? And so, Jesus shows up. Oh yeah, he was the son of that carpenter guy. I remember.
They're very judgmental.
People are people, That's just. But they'll pick out the thing they can identify you with and cling to that because why? Being able to anchor you to something familiar, they're comfortable with that. We all are. We don't want the unfamiliar intruding too much into our lives and getting us, outside the boundaries of acceptable thought. Harold.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer some of these questions has to do with what historians refer to as historiography, in other words, how you do history. And I read this as a question. I don't know.
Sorry, Lydia.
Taking a position. But if it was a matter of, the writers of the Gospels, and I take a pretty conservative idea of Scripture being inspired, but I also believe in God using these writers.
If y'all need to get to choir practice and stuff, head on out, guys. I'm going to entertain this question from Harold, and we're done. But go for it.
But I'm just wondering, if they were still back in Israel, then maybe some of the early events that say Luke wrote about the birth of Jesus wasn't because he was there, with Joseph and Mary.
Yeah, he obviously wasn't.
He's got his information from others about that period way back.
And very well known. The birth of Jesus was, widely proclaimed and everything. And I'm saying, had there been this miracle family just living around Israel and Nazareth and all that, there would have been story after story collected about that.
So the gospel writers, they weren't aware of what Jesus was doing in England, let's say, because they were getting their information about his birth later on. I mean, it was not.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't
Right.
like, Fox or CNN reporting it, the second it happened. They were getting that later on. And so that whole period, and after that information, they didn't have sources for that.
Right, and there seems to be an absence of instances to be reported during that time, is the bigger picture we're looking at with that. And clearly, Jesus traveled other places too, if you can get your head around that, and it was probably in India and a few other locations. Yes, ma'am?
Well, the big thing is the New Testament wasn't written until after Jesus died.
Correct.
But nobody was keeping records of what he did as a teenager, and the birth was different. I don't know who retained those records.
Right, right. Well, obviously, this would have been a big deal within the family and within the record keepers of their tribe and all of that.
No, it's only visit to the, at 12, when he went in, that would have been part of their record.
Yeah, yeah. And chances are his family was visiting Jerusalem for Passover like Jews from all over the world did for Passover. See? Yes. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. And so the family, if no one else, were keeping close records on all of that. Anyway, interesting stuff. I wanted to prompt rhetorical questions out there just to get your thoughts spinning kind of in that direction to see what you turn up. Anything else? Because I know I went over time and I apologize for that. In my defense, we started a little late. My fault too, probably. Thanks, guys. Great study. Final study on this will be next Wednesday, or at least for now.